Well, welcome back to part 2 of the upgrade to the electrical system of this 68 Mustang. Now, there's a bit of continuity issue, and I apologize for that, but my camera is not going to be able to do what I need it to do. I tried to use the zoom feature, obviously not enough pixels in my cameras. It turned out terrible. Very small images, it was horrible. So, until I upgrade my video equipment, I had to reshoot some of the sequences, so I apologize. As you can see, the fuse box is already on. I've captured how I did that, so you'll see that coming up. But like I said, so sorry about the continuity issues. But basically, the wiring harness that you see in front of me is the main wiring harness, right? This is the one that goes obviously to the fuse box. It's the one that comes from under the hood, gets power into the car. All of the connectors for the instrument cluster are all here. So these are the important part of the car. All the rest of the harnesses in the car are nothing but runs that go into the trunk, that run, get off the tail lights or the fuel gauge, or go under the hood, which is over here. This goes under the hood because this is goes to the engine, right? So this will be where I get the connections for the oil pressure and all of that. So like I said, all of that is here. Wiring's in good shape. I'm not worried about the wiring. It is very pliable. The plastic hasn't gone hard on it. Now the key is I'm going to be taking load away from this harness. So if anything, this harness really is just going to be carrying load for very simple things like the instrumentation or the accessories like the interior lights. It's no longer taking the load for the rest of the car because all of that is going to be coming directly off of this new fuse box. I'm going to bypass the wiring anyways. So even if it is a 50-year-old harness, I'm asking less of it than I would have normally asked of it, so I'm not concerned there at all. Plus also, as you saw in my previous video, I'm going to be putting a big fuse block on this thing, so I'm going to protect this whole circuit anyways. So if I have a master fuse failure, I can figure out what went wrong and then replace the master fuse, and I'm back on the road. So basically, let's get started. I'm going to splice back into where I was before, and then we'll put this video together for you. Now, as I mentioned before, and I'll get some closer shots, but right now you can see standard fuse box has 5 fuses, and in this is simply the heater, heater, accessories, radio, hazards, and I forgot the other couple, but like I said, we'll be looking at that closer. Obviously, some concerns. This is for the high beam, low beam switch, and what they had done is simply taken the 2 lines, stuffed them together, and thrown some tape around it, right? So that's not a good thing. So I have a new harness for the high beam, low beam switch, so that'll have to get corrected. Obviously other places where they've done some pretty lousy connections on the wiring, so we're going to have to be going through this entire harness. Now the nice thing about it is, as you can see, there's a drop here. This drop is where, as I said, this is great because this will allow me to run the harness a little higher up in the car. This gives me the flexibility now that the new fuse panel will go here, and then this can then swing down, and I have lots of wires, so this is really good for me. Now, an initial inspection from doing a bunch of twisting and grabbing wires and bending them to see if they crack, because that's really the only way to test if the wiring is still okay. I mean, we're going to be looking at all the connectors. We're going to make sure they're all clean. I'm going to get the copper cleaning line. It's electronic cleaner, but you can clean all the connections out. We're going to validate which one of these are ground wires, which are power wires, and we've got a multimeter to do that. And I'm going to start marking all of these so I know what's a ground, what's not a ground, what's feed, what power has, etc. So I'll be doing that for the harness as well. And like I said, just really, this is real quick. Let's get in close now and take a look at some of the problems. So as I mentioned, sorry about the continuity issues. As I said, the fuse box has already been cut out. But what I found online, obviously, is a description of the fuse box. And as you can see by the description here, these 2 fuses are switched. That means they come from the ignition switch, and they drive the accessories, and they drive the heater. So these 2 fuses are just for accessories and heater, and as I said, I'm going to be bypassing the heater anyways. This center fuse is a stand-alone fuse. There's a wire that comes from the headlight switch, which is the dimmer, passes through the fuse and then just simply returns back to the instrument cluster, and that dims or brightens the instrument cluster. So like I said, that's a standalone fuse, and how I took care of that in the new iteration is I have simply a standalone fuse that handles the wire coming in and wire going back for the instrument cluster. These two fuses over here are constant power. So this just has a constant power coming to it. This is for the courtesy lights and dome, and these are for the emergency flashers, and I believe the brake lights. I think both of them are for constant power. So of course they're going to map directly over to the new fuse box. So the internet also indicated the colors of the wiring. So the ignition switch coming in, because these are switched, is black and green. So what I did is I took that black and green wire, and that's now being a trigger for my relay. So the amount of power coming through here now is not going to drive accessories and heaters. All it's got to do is snap a relay over. That will then power up my switched side, and then of course on the switch side I can now put the heater, and of course I can put the accessories. On the direct current side, what I did is I took the two items here, which of course are the courtesy lights and dome and the emergency flashers, and they are now fuses 1 and 2 on the new breaker. So what I did is I simply wired them in, and again the color coding was pretty close. Here it said blue and white on the emergency flashers, but it ends up being that the emergency flashers are red and white. And again what I did is I simply used my multimeter, touched it from here over to of course the flasher unit, which is here, and you can even see the red and white wire. You can see the red and white wire over here. And what that is that that's continuity. So obviously that's that is the flashers. So I simply snipped out the old breaker, put the new breaker in, and now the second challenge I had, and I'll just show that in a few seconds, is that where I wanted to mount this isn't going to happen. Well, they always say, you know, best laid plans. So unfortunately, I was trying to find a location for my swing down bracket for my fuse panel. I went over here, but what I did is I put all of the items underneath the dashboard that are eventually going to go back in. So, of course, there's the driver's vent, and if you look, there's no room between the driver's vent and the dash for me to install anything that's going to swing up. Over here, I can't do anything because that's where the steering column comes up. Over here, I was originally planning on putting it underneath the ashtray and the ignition switch. But then when I put in the wiper motor, obviously the wiper motor is right in here, so I can't put it here either. Now I can't put it under this area because this is where my console is. Then I go over here to the left to the glove box, and you find that the heater box, yet again, is in the way. So there's no clearance in here, even over in here. So there's really no place for me to put a swing down bracket. So then I went back to the original location. So this is where the fuse box originally would have gone. Now it was a lot smaller, but in my case, you know, the ground block, which is at the top, can just go a little higher. I don't care, because you don't need access to that. But where I just need access to are the fuses, and those again are, you know, relatively low, and they of course clear the throttle linkage. So really, I guess it's just going to be permanently mounted there. So there we go. All the plans for a swing down fuse box are gone. So the fuse box, as we've now located, will go up on the firewall where it went in the first place. So I'm just going to put it up a little higher. I'll still be able to get to the fuses, so there's not a problem there. That also makes it easier for me as well, because the wires that were originally connected to the original fuse box have the length I need to simply connect to the new one. So I've got no issues there either, so I don't need to extend these. I'll simply attach them. I'm going to be obviously using rings and solder and shrink wrap, no tape. Once those are in place, I'll be able to then take the entire harness, put it in the car, mount this, because everything else that's going to go on from now on, you know, power that's going to go to the seats, or power that's going to go to the AC heater, the power that's going to go to the windows, all of that's brand new wiring, right? That's going to come off of the fuse block and go where it needs to go. I'm not going to be taxing the original wiring harness for any of the new equipment. In fact, I've taken a load away from the old wiring harness. Like I said, the switch coming off the ignition no longer has to feed the heater and everything. It's just got to feed a relay. All of the wiring in here for like the stereo and all of that, or the radio, again, that's all going to be bypassed. So I have no concerns about the harness because I've actually reduced the load on it, not increased it. So there's not a concern of the harness spontaneously combusting on me. So next thing to do, start putting the eyelets on these, connect it up, get it into the car, and then start running the new wire while she's apart. I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so before we put the harness back in the car, what I wanted to do is check a few things. So now here's the high beam, low beam switch. Now this normally goes down on the foot. What they had done is simply taken these two connectors and taped them together. And that was for the low beam. The green was sitting by itself, which would be for the high beam. Now I verified this. I have a wiring diagram for this car. It gives me all the color codes. I was able to trace these back. And as an added positive is that this red yellow actually goes back to the headlights switch, and the headlight switch, there's the red yellow. I already checked that for continuity. So this will be hot. And then of course you're going to have high beam and low beam. Now here is a standard floor switch. It has the 3 wires. Of course I'm using the connector. I've already pinned this out, so we know that this is the power in, and one of these will be there. So that one you can see is reading 0. This one, of course, is reading nothing unless I flip the switch. And now this one is obviously reading a 0 continuity or full continuity, and this one's reading 0. So we know this is the hot. So we're going to take the red, yellow to hot. Now, as far as these two, it really doesn't matter which side I use because this is simply a this is not an off-on. This is an oscillating switch. So every time you press it, it switches to the next one. You press it again, it switches back to the next one. So basically, it doesn't really matter. If I turn on the headlights and they're high beam, I hit the switch and they'll go to low beam. But the key now is we have to make sure that this red, yellow goes to the center, and then the 2 go to the side. And we'll take care of that right now. Okay, soldered together. I put the shrink wrap on. Of course, make sure you put the shrink wrap on before you solder. And then all we got to do is shrink the shrink wrap. Well, as you can see, the fuse box is now in place. I haven't tightened the wires up yet because I'm just really trying to do an initial fit. Fuse box is in, the relay is in, the wiring is connected. As you can see, the wiper motor is in, and the reason I put the wiper motor in is because that whole bracket up in that area, you know, takes some space, and you have to make sure that the wiring harness clears it. It's not bolted down, it's just, again, in place. Also, in the meantime, what I had done is I also rebuilt the wiper motor. Very simple to do. You can remove the main gear, and that allows you to pull the whole motor off, and then, of course, you can take the motor apart and clean all of the armature and the brushes and put the whole thing back together. Then I re-greased it. I tested it on the bench and it works beautifully. In fact, that the wiper switch and also the foot pedal work wonderfully. The motor cycles and then it returns itself back to the parked position, which is perfect. So as we move along, you can see that the wiring harness gets a little crunched in here. But everything's in the right place because there's, of course, is the plug for the ignition. And then, of course, the harness comes up in through behind it. And then as it moves across the side here, it then just simply works its way across this side. And of course, comes to the instrument cluster. And of course, there's my for the washers to connect to the washers. And you have all the instrument cluster in here. This is the old headlight switch, and I just put it in there just so that I can make sure that the connector reaches the headlight switch because it needs to do that. And then it kinks down and goes down to the side here, and then of course it connects up into the back, and that's where it runs out into the engine bay and where it picks up the power and brings the power in, and of course also runs the headlights and all the other switches and everything that go out there as well. So that's it for part 2. Wiring harness is all done. All of the corrections that I needed to make to the wiring harness I've made. We put in obviously the new high beam, low beam. I corrected some of the wiring on the door switch. So as far as the harness is done, we've got the new fuse boxes in. Obviously the wiring, as you saw, is not where it's going to eventually be because I'm going to take it back out. Because again, this is just a test fit to make sure everything works. So in the next episode, we're going to build that timer delay that I showed you, talked to earlier about, which was going to allow the interior lights to come on and stay on regardless of the doors. When you close the doors, the lights would stay on, same with the fogs. So we'll build that next one. Then part 4 will be the wiring to all of the accessories, but that probably won't happen until a little bit more of the body work is done and the car is closer to its assembled state. That way there I can test fit all the taillights, I can put everything in, and that's when we'll fire it up, make sure all the lighting works, make sure everything works, and again, that'll be part 4. But until then, take it easy, and I'll see you soon.